The Healing House. You'll have to be transferred to stay at the Sick Cows until we know how to support you better, when we've found out more. The doctor had told this to the patient. Just until we can do more assessments, find out what's going on with you. Went on the doctor, then fetching out the leaflets of the place he was referring him to. The patient would have to be sent to there. Sick cows? Well, I know I'm a moody git sometimes. I'm not an animal, though, pleaded the patient, half sarcastic, but half serious, though. He felt he was becoming more animalistic, more primal. Perhaps he was in his struggle against the disease, but still, he had the right to be with his own kind, with other people, even if they were with sick people, and not with other sick animals, surely. He'd half wondered if they were sending patients off to care for the sick animals. Surely not. How could he do that? The doctor seemed too sensible, too reasonable for that. And besides, he, an urban man, from his mother town, he'd no experience with the cows, never mind caring for obese, traumatized, or diseased cows. He'd had visions of hot-tempered, moody, mad cows, skulking under the shady trees in the sweltering summer heats, struggling with their distorted, delusional, feverish cow dreams. The doctor, though, had laughed, saying, No. I meant to stay at the sick house, pronouncing now the words more carefully, separately. For a moment he wasn't sure if his fears were being laughed at, though, but the doctor had spoken kindly and softly, yet with some firmness too, having given a list of the problems that the patient had faced, given them a serious consideration during their conversation. There may be a few poorly cats, and even dogs. I think the house has adopted them, as I understand it, said the doctor, ruffling through some paperwork. But no cows, as far as I understand it. No. He then laughed, still smiling, and the patient now relaxing, allowing himself to smile and reciprocate the laugh belatedly with the doctor. Laughing at his own silly thoughts, he began looking over the leaflets that he was handed about the supported house. Well, thank goodness, they make smelly roommates anyway, said the patient. And the patient had said this as he was glancing through the pictures of the residents in the various pages of the leaflets that he was thumbing through. The doctor, though, had frowned slightly, unsure of whether he'd actually moved on in conversation or still actually talking about only his imaginary cows or the patients in the pictures he was looking at. Perhaps the cows squatted in an old barn many times. When I used to go rolling, travelling in the country, it was sometimes between farms, explained the patient then, when it was too late to find anywhere else to stay. So I know they make smelly roommates, clarified the patient. And then he put the leaflets aside to look up. Well, I can assure you it'll be more comfortable than an old barn, said the doctor, reassuring. Right, not so many farts in the morning, I guess, the patient attempted to joke. Well, some of the rooms are shared, but the bedrooms are all singles, the doctor confirmed. Oh, well, just my own farts in the morning and the night, said the patient. And in the day there's also a garden, went on the doctor, though not laughing at this. It's attached to the house, he went on commenting. At least there you'll have a clean room, comfortable enough to rest in and study, do whatever you're able to do, before you're able to go out and see others, the doctor went on, imploringly. The pictures of the house in the brochure looked good, of course, it would. Like the travel brochures, the pictures of larger hotels. It looked like a larger Georgian, older building, though it looked like a vast complex, with many colourful patchworks of clean, if quite old, rugs. Maybe a lot of them unfurled along the winding corridors. It seemed to be quite dusty, but nevertheless, they looked in general quite clean. No, with pictures hung in their neat, lined-up rows along the clean, non-offensive walls that had large, pale colours on them. There were a variety of different ornaments that appeared placed on the tables, placed about with lots of space to manoeuvre around them. and with a large lounge full of smiling faces, people crammed, sat on various couches, sofas, and different chairs placed around, with patients sat, each holding up some picture. Within the picture itself, there were either sat or slumped, or some that were propped up in various supporting chairs, and the various other lounge sofas that were placed around different shaped and sized tables that were then covered in stacks and piles of books and newspapers, magazines, paint pots, and that had lots of pictures strewn about them on top as well, with dozens of brushes that were stood in their big pot containers. There were a variety also of thriving green plants sprouting out of various ceramic pots in different colours, and they were stood and positioned in different parts of the room, on either side of the fireplace, on the mantel shelf, and on various shelves in different corners, and also in different tables where there was room. They were on the window ledges too, and on the mantel above the fireplaces. There also were the photos of people that were out in the garden, out in their wheelchairs, or even men with crutches sometimes. Then there were those with legs that had been bandaged up, wrapped up arms or heads, or even part of bodies in bandage. Even a few that were wheeled out on beds in the gardens, with patients often lying down or sitting partly up amongst the giant bushes and trees and flowers and the lawns that were scattered all around them on either side, and with a dazzling, colourful collection of flowers often seen in the pictures, sometimes to the side or beyond the patients, that they were watching over, studying the faces of the people closely. No, they weren't all smiling, the patient had thought, looking at the many pictures carefully, he surmised. Yet many of them were quite happy. A few seemed to be ecstatic on some of them, as if laughing at some unknown joke, perhaps. Yet even those were still looking quite serious sometimes, as if some, a great many, were quite poker-faced, not giving much away. They weren't frowning particularly, and certainly not crying in any noticeable way, and not in any noticeable pain either, though not joyful either. No, they just seemed to be quite neutral-faced, a great many of them. No, the brochure seemed to be quite authentic and plausible. They didn't seem to be too happy or too sad, perhaps. Perhaps the place was ideal, or as much as one could hope for in the circumstances that they would be in, especially if they all did have a wide variety of different problems and hardships. Even so, it appeared from the photographs, and the great many there were, that the house was offering a wide variety of different activities that could be tailored sometimes around those many different conditions that the different patients would have. So they assured the potential new patients there was great hope eventually of finding different activities to fit around the conditions when they were understood much more. There was always something, some kind of therapy or activity, some kind of work, some play, something that could be found, they claimed, eventually to fit around the needs and abilities or the disabilities of the various patients. Certainly many, perhaps even most activities of the house would not be possible, would not be suitable or relevant to a great many of the residents within there. Yet some of them hopefully would be, and they could find those eventually in time. Whether it was a talking together, chanting together, singing together, even a silent meditation together, drawing together, sculpting together, even reading and writing together. Many different kinds of activities, dancing together, debating together, the gardening together projects, playing games together, cooking together. There seem to be countless different activity groups together, or different therapy groups too, even cleaning together, though not all of them, and that one didn't sound so fun, nor did many others the patient had read about, who looked a little incredulous, uncertain how on earth that seriously ill people could be expected to dance or debate or to join in any kind of dramatic groups. But then again, they wouldn't all necessarily be qualified or be able to participate in all of the groups, as the brochure had stated. But if their focus was divided and split between the effects of the illness and the activities themselves, then they might struggle, and he had his doubts, not knowing that. Of course, there was no expectation he'd have to join all of the dozens and dozens of different groups, nor would any of them, only those that they would be able to, if the illness didn't prevent him too much, and the disabilities. He'd had as much fear as excitement and desire to meet the others, the other sick residents, and finally, of course, to meet other sick people. Who knows, maybe even to meet other sick friends while he was there, however long. Although, wasn't it equally possible that he might meet other sick agitators, other people that were going through their own depression and anger and resentment and confusion, and not just joy and hope? What if it was all full of angry, confused, or depressed people? He imagined it could be quite hellish as much as heavenly. Perhaps he'd be surrounded by dying cries, moaning, groaning, yelping, crying, or silent sufferers, even worse, that would puncture his continual dreams, greet him in the mornings, stalk him to the room each morning and day. Perhaps angry, bitter monologues, wild at family, resentful at societies, would be preached at him for days and weeks and months on end, through his days unending. And surely he got quite enough of his own on his plate without hearing about other people's disease worries and challenges, without having to take on others' emotionals, or encounter many other diseased meditations when he had his own to encounter and to deal with. It all sounded like madness sometimes when he thought of it. In one sense, how could the sick going through their own troubles be of any real support to others that were sick too? And yet surely there was just as great hope and desire and an ultimate goal of finally being able to empathize with others, of understanding and being understood, being in a similar position to others, however different, but recognizing the many similarities of many others going through similar hardships, albeit there may be quite different types of suffering, but there may be many similar types of suffering too. Perhaps they weren't all in the same kind of sinking ship, but maybe many different kinds. But his own little sinking ship, and his own private tragedy, maybe he could relate to many others' private tragedies, as all others must have. But drifting endlessly, passing other working ships, party ships, adventure ships, all those that he'd been on through the decades, that were all ongoing and going off somewhere, and not just drifting endlessly, as all the others had been, round and round and round, in endless oceanic whirlpools, as many were, for many weeks and months and years sometimes too. It was hard to understand that, without going through it yourself though. Perhaps those who had different kinds of sickness, and thus different kinds of abilities, as well as disabilities, they could too support him in some ways that he couldn't himself, and had different insights that he didn't himself. Who knew? Maybe even in his diseased state that he was in, with his reduced abilities, perhaps he could too give some support to others, as well as receive some from others struggling too. But he had his doubts. Perhaps it was exchanging one limbo for just another kind of limbo, and not really a heavenly or a hellish place at all, really. Well, he wasn't sure after long consideration. After all the long times living alone so much of the time, a long time with the disease also had its good and its bad too. Solitude did. It wasn't only good, nor only bad. Just like seeing other people regularly, with taking on all their other challenges, as well as all their other good insights too, could potentially have its good and bad. His solitude, perhaps like others, had given a lot of time for self-reflection, to work on self-esteem, and his own self-ideas to be questioned and worked through. And yet to know himself once more, as much as it was a good thing and liberating, was a hardship and difficult and alienating too sometimes, with the dangers of self-absorption, of narcissism, with delusions of grandeur or worthlessness sometimes, unchecked and unregulated, uncriticised then by others for long periods of time, being alone a lot with your own disease, but it was being alone a lot with your own ideas that you had to challenge yourself and couldn't then rely on other people too. But it was a kind of trial, being alone, as perhaps this other place of being with others suffering was too. It was a kind of trial and challenges that it brought as much as sometimes joy. Not that having the illness was a joy, but being able to be alone so much and to control how you dealt with it and the ill effects of it. The solitude had its good and bad. It was in a sense a wonderful gift as much as a hard test of character. But he figured from other people's reports, living with others more, with their own suffering, and trying to help each other and guide each other, restraining each other, dealing more with each other's problems, thinking and feeling for each other too. This also could be a kind of joy, but a trial as well, he considered, thinking more about the other's experiences that had experienced those things themselves. He'd got a taxi with all his worldly possessions, many suitcases stuffed with old poems, stories, and then a backpack that was crammed full of different seasonal clothing. That also bulged out into a couple of black bags that couldn't be fitted into the backpack, that the driver himself had struggled to cram into the boot. The large backpack had then collapsed onto the back seat, like some corpse that he was forced to carry round with him, some drunk who had to be pushed in and out of taxis, unconscious, as he sat in the front seat with the collapsed, passed-out friend behind him, with carrier bags of books sat between the legs on the floor, and then another box on his lap, with his pruned back house plants, all in their little pots, cradled on his lap. He felt a little crazy, with the thick foliage of the leaves sprouting out, bursting out of their stems, so tall they obscured his vision looking out of the car, so that he couldn't see clearly where he was going. He couldn't see much through the green foliage of the plants that he was carrying hold of. Couldn't see through them to know where they were driving to. Could only then turn to one side, and then turning to the other to chat to the driver, who was mostly focused on the road, looking ahead and quite focused, following the fembot's spoken directions, giving him some guidance of where to turn and how far to go. Who'd been given the postcode. The driver had then put that into the machine. He told the driver when he had to turn soon, as the fembot had given the driver all the instructions from the program's postcode given to it. So then the patient himself could relax more and didn't have to worry about giving constant directions to the taxi driver manoeuvring round the streets, as had happened in countless past journeys, when he journeyed as the driver's companion, and, of course, before the age of sat-nav itself and the computer directions, when he'd had to study maps and hold them and be the navigator for the driver, and struggling woefully with that sometimes. How often had he given wrong directions, especially when he'd been wary about it himself, and when the sickness had gotten worse, and he'd lost focus and forgotten the point on when to turn before it was too late. And he was so focused then on breathing, controlling the symptoms, or just trying to adjust himself to fit comfortably into the chair he was now squashed in, to find a way to endure the challenge, being cramped up with the condition. How many times had he annoyed the driver, having to loop back on himself, and then taking wild routes all the way along, wound round long scenic routes. So on this last journey he was on, he was relieved he didn't really have to guide him anymore, and the driver could make his own way there, based on the directions given to him. The driver had spoken little, wished him well in his pleasant and very helpful, insisting on carrying out all of the bags for the patient, who was struggling enough with the bulk of bags that he was carrying. And then there was the box of houseplants too, that he'd had on his lap. He'd clung on to that on the lap during the bumpy ride there. Still, there was no offer to carry it for him. Once all of the things had been discharged, carried out, and then placed onto the pavement carefully. No offer to carry it from further up the road there, where he had been dropped off. And he'd been told that staff would meet him and escort him inside the house. Hopefully. He thought they'd help him carry it all in, up the long garden path. He warily now peeped through the iron gates, outside the garden gates, to see the distant steep steps that led to the high-up door, way up through the garden. How did they expect a frail, elderly, or sick patient to vault up those steep steps, even if there was a handrail to one side? The middle-aged patient shook his head in some disbelief, wary at only the thought of it. The steps looked smaller on the patient's more apparent journey, looking from the distance. But they looked daunting in reality, though, even if they'd looked smaller from the picture. Especially with his many possessions that he'd have to carry. He'd have to make multiple risky trips back and forth, leaving the belongings, all of them behind on the street, in the hope that no one would decide to run off with an old bag of books, or a backpack of old tatty clothes, stuffed into the backpack, or the black bags as well. The staff, if they refused to help him, but surely they'd insist on helping, and they would assist him, once it was the time, for he could not do it all, carrying it all, alone on one journey. Perhaps they would assist him and carry it all together, and leave nothing behind on the street of strangers. His fear of the driver getting lost in such remote hilly countrysides, that was quite out of town, so far from where he ever knew, led him to get there too early, though. So he'd had 15 minutes then to wait on the street, where he then perched on the backpack, sitting and resting on it, using it then as a seat, to rest his weary back against the garden wall on the outside, lining the long pavement. To rest on the actual backpack, propping his knees up, getting no answer then as he tried to call from the phone on his mobile, from the home's reception telephone landline that just rung and rung endlessly. They must be quite busy, as it only rang and rang with no answer. So he'd given up after a while, and would await them at the allotted time later. And then awaited for the right time. Why hadn't he just asked the driver to assist him carry up the stupid bags? He didn't want the man to think or to know that he was weaker, or that he was vulnerable and couldn't do it, or had too many things that he couldn't carry himself. Or was it that the man was a stranger, and he just wasn't sure if he should have altered or offered to pay him much more? Or perhaps the man would think that he was using him as some personal servant or something, and he was acting all lordly and superior and demanding he carry his things for him like some servant or something, not knowing his own illness and his weakness and his inabilities to do that for himself. And then he'd have to explain his own physical condition, the pains and the strains, to a complete stranger who didn't know. And he didn't want to do that, not with a stranger, not with someone he hardly knew, and had only spoken to very briefly, for only an hour or so. A couple passed by him on the street, complete strangers, interrupting some idle thought, some passing daydream, some conversation they were having, to eye him as they passed by. Then they stopped, a gap in their conversation, hushing, silently staring down to him, briefly, before their talk, a little down the road, continued. And as more then passed by, strolling by him, sauntering along, chatting in different catches of conversation he overheard, he began to feel more aware of his own position, that appeared like some vagrant slumped on a street, in his bedraggled, old, dusty, dirty clothes, like some vagrant homeless man, especially with his wild and unkempt hair, haphazardly thrown together clothes. He looked like a jumble sale of costumes thrown together by some half-blind, dim-witted man, and his stubble so thick and overgrown, with stained clothes and ripped off, tatty, worn-through clothing. Well, with all of that and the dumped bags, the old black bags that had holes and poking through clothing, his whole dilapidated state perhaps made him appear as that. But only the box of houseplants, perched to one side, nestled in front of him, appearing out, with their long, thick green foliage, their different flowers and their leaves, appeared to give him a different era, a different aura about him. The box of houseplants that was stood in front of him gave him more of an appearance of some transplanter, of some gardener, some vagrant gardener at least. Perhaps he'd pass as a travelling vagrant gardener or something, and not just some vagrant only, some bohemian, weird, hippie gardener moving homes, he'd hoped they'd assume. Anyway, who cared what strangers and thought about things, he eventually mused, shaking his head at his own over-worrying, looking up to read the expressions sometimes as the conversation chatters had then approached him, just briefly before looking around again, with a mixture of different concerned, intrigued, and sometimes even a slight annoyance on their faces as they peered over towards his vagrant, weird position, and even some humorous looks, as if he looked a little strange and funny. A few seemed to purse their lips a little, offer a little sympathetic smile even, and even a little nod sometimes, a slight bow of the head, as if in some acknowledgement to some fallen status that he was in now, in a very sympathetic, kindly way. And then there were a few others that looked slightly down and over, giving a little frown, and also looking a little puzzled, perhaps, just briefly, perhaps at the sight of him, or perhaps even the smell, perhaps, he wondered, given the musty old bags, things that just, yes, they hadn't been washed in an age, especially the bags themselves, and he thought maybe he should have done that, but it was only the outside of the things, and wouldn't have gotten the clothes any dirtier anyway, even if they were grubby and stained awfully, and he regretted not washing those now, nevertheless. But still, then a couple seemed to shake their heads quite a lot, and they were staring at him, with the noses turned up a little, and they seemed to tut and grimace just a little, but he couldn't blame them either. He thought that perhaps he was a vulgar sight to them, and perhaps a little smelly for them, especially with all their mucky bags of things, and some of them there was even food that he placed on top, so he could have easy access to have a snack and have a drink, things that had fallen out when the bags had been carried clumsily out from the taxi, and things had fallen out and he'd not yet picked and pushed them all back in and repackaged them all carefully away. Yes, and they'd fallen and stumbled out onto what was a beautifully paved street that was very clean and carefully looked after, and he thought perhaps he was a vulgar sight to it, and could understand them looking down on him even. He thought of shouting some kind of remark to reassure them. He wouldn't be here long, don't worry, moving on soon, but he thought better of it, and kept on his silent vigil, sat there, slumped, and then waiting for the staff to appear and for the right time. For the 15 minutes of the homelessness was really nothing, of course, only a brief time. He'd survived a year of it before, well, even a few months, though he'd been in and out of others' houses, and never quite houseless for most of the time. Albeit, he was really, strictly speaking, only out of the house and homeless for 2 months of that time. But he'd been staying in various tents, allotments, sheds, car parks, temporary squats, abandoned buildings, many different places, even seeking shelter at a new building, with the howling winds that swept through doorless and windowless buildings, just in desperation, when the weather had turned bad, in a few unknown towns where he'd arrived at, whose internal walls had been broken and crumbled down through years of neglect and unused. But those were only brief places that he'd stayed at, briefly in passing. He'd skulked between them and visited them a long time ago, in those dilapidated shelters. Staying up briefly, they had kept him warm and insulated against the worst of the cold, howling, harsh, cold winds that chased people off the streets and into their shelters, however old or new, challenging to get into or to even get out of. The ferociously icy cold winds that had swept him into the larger skips and even into rubbish dumpsters on the desperate times. As it was back then, even into some dilapidated buildings that were better than being out in icy cold winds, when even a dry bed of rotting food and old mucky clothes in a skip was still preferable to an icy cold rainfall. He gave thanks to whatever higher or lower power had guided and protected him through that, after remembering some of his harsher times. That his long time of being on the streets, with everything he'd owned, and the illness, was only really so brief. He said and he thought thankful things, trying to remember happier times, even in the hardships when he'd found support. He'd been well and able enough and fit enough to endure and struggle against those elements, and also to have found the support away from the worst ferociousness of the elements to survive those things. And that, during his long illness, he was glad that he'd mostly been sheltered and protected and not been homeless and out on the streets like that, protected from the most severity of the elements, whilst he suffered with the hardship of the disease and its pains and strains. He'd gone through a past homeless trial, or homeless journey, and only later had he begun the sickness trial, navigating the complex challenge of enduring through a long disease. There were always challenges, trials, to test anyone's character and their resolve. There could be vastly very different kinds of trials and challenges, but surely his life, as much as others, was a series of differing, changing trials, a series of different lessons to learn, as well as different joys to experience too, a series of different kinds of friendships, of lovers, acquaintances, a series of different virtues, of different flaws as well, and different faults, and all those that would accumulate through all the many differing trials through his lifelong age. He gave thanks for providence, for moderation, that all of the trials, although had been serious, and the fact that they were not all happening at once, and yet there was a series of the different trials, and gave thanks for that. And in a funny way, he thought perhaps it was better all the many different kinds of love and lovers didn't all happen at once. And certainly it was better that all the different kinds of hardship, suffering, trials didn't always happen at once, but happen in a series, in a sequence, however much it was changing and hard to keep up with. In an earlier trial, he was a victim perhaps of abuse and psychological abuse that he'd gone through, being regularly shouted at in insulting ways, hourly, daily, weekly and monthly sometimes, being ignored at for long periods of time too, being censored, blamed at for genuine mistakes he could not help, or for other people's things too. For long, lengthy periods of time, months and years, that he'd endured that to varying extents. And he'd pretended to be as stupid, as if he pretended to be as stupid and slow as he could be, and really wasn't actually that, and just was a slow person in some times. But he was also cared for by many others during that trial as well, so he felt both loved, yet also victimised, both things, with great amounts of each though. So even that, such a mixed up childhood, being the loved and cared for victim, was some kind of trial. And in many years later, gratitude would grow, as would resentment and bitterness and confusion and doubt and uncertainty about what happened and what even did happen. That would struggle against the desire to move on and forget and to just focus on the here and now and only the present and the future. There was a desire, though, to be more accurate of the wider context as the many years had gone on, to try and perceive the situation, the trial, as well as the love in the past, in a relation to all other situations, to a wider context, to wider situations of many others that he'd met, so that he could discern and then judge more fairly both his own, but also others' conduct and suffering and abilities, as well as the virtues too, to get more of a broader sense than just an isolated sense that he'd had for so long in those earlier years. He felt very differently about the domestic trials. Well, many decades on, he didn't feel that anger intensely for others, or that love that had really degraded himself in earlier hyper-emotional times. Neither did he feel the great pity, only doubts and uncertainty, seeing that they'd done so much good, as well as there had been so much abuses that had occurred as well. But so unsure if they'd only done him good, but also had done bad as well. It was very hard to weigh up the differences when there's so vast amounts over such long periods of time. If they'd only done him good, and only good deeds, then it would be a simple thing to look at. Or if they'd only caused abuse to him and caused harmship unnecessarily, then it would be easy to look at too. But when it was a mixed thing and different, then it was difficult to weigh things up. When you felt both in love and also mixed up and angry and confused and hurt deeply about many things and many people too, then it was quite hard to know. And he felt it was hard how to deal with his feelings.